Snow lay thick on the cobblestones as the Baron's estate prepared for Christmas, a season meant to celebrate mercy, family, and redemption. Candles burned in every window, bells rang from the chapel tower, and servants moved silently through halls heavy with wealth and tradition. Yet beneath the polished rituals of faith and generosity, something far darker arrived at the gates that morning. A human life wrapped not in silk or gold but in chains. The gift was presented with forced smiles and bowed heads. An enslaved woman, catalogued like property, offered as a symbol of loyalty and favor. The Baron barely glanced at her at first. To him, she was meant to be another possession, another proof of his power, another indulgence disguised as generosity. But as she was brought closer, as candlelight fell upon her face, the air in the room shifted. Recognition struck not like thunder, but like a slow, crushing weight. The woman standing before him carried the same eyes, the same shape of mouth, the same quiet familiarity he had buried under years of privilege and denial. In that instant, Christmas lost its hymns and warmth, replaced by a silence thick with horror. This is a story about bloodlines severed by cruelty, about how slavery did not just destroy strangers but tore families apart, turning brothers into masters and sisters into property. It is a tale where celebration becomes accusation, where faith is tested against greed, and where a single moment forces a man to confront the cost of the world he helped build. The Baron was born into a world where power was not earned but inherited, handed down like land deeds and titles, reinforced by the quiet obedience of everyone beneath him. From childhood he was taught that his name carried weight, that his blood placed him above consequence, and that the world existed in careful layers designed to serve those at the top. His earliest memories were not of affection or shared laughter but of vast rooms, distant parents, and servants who never met his eyes. Authority surrounded him before he could understand it, shaping his sense of self long before he could question it. Tutors instructed him in languages, law, and scripture, but more important lessons were delivered without words. He learned that commands did not need explanation, that disobedience was a flaw in others rather than a challenge to himself, and that suffering when it occurred below his station was simply the natural order of things. The estate operated like a living organism built around his family's comfort, and he grew up watching people bend, wait, and endure in silence. These observations hardened into assumptions that followed him into adulthood, forming the foundation of a belief system where domination felt not cruel but normal. Religion played its role, not as a source of humility but as justification. He was taught that God had ordained hierarchies, that some were born to rule and others to serve, and that prosperity was evidence of divine favor. Sermons spoke of charity, but charity was framed as an act of generosity from above, never as an obligation of equality. He learned to kneel in prayer without ever questioning why others knelt before him. Faith became another instrument reinforcing his sense of entitlement, a moral varnish applied to practices that benefited him and his peers. As he grew older, the Baron's education expanded beyond books and sermons into practical demonstrations of power. He accompanied his father to land negotiations, disputes, and transactions where human lives were discussed in the same measured tone as livestock or grain. Numbers were assigned to people, productivity calculated, obedience evaluated. He learned to appraise worth not by character but by utility. When discomfort flickered within him during these moments, it was quickly smothered by praise and reassurance that this was how the world functioned, how it had always functioned, how it must continue to function for stability to survive. By the time the Baron inherited his title, his authority felt as natural as breathing. He did not see himself as cruel. Cruelty in his mind required intention, and he believed himself merely to be maintaining order. Decisions that shattered lives were made behind polished desks, and sealed with wax, distant enough to avoid personal responsibility. His identity was intertwined with control, and any challenge to that control felt like a threat to his very existence. Power was not something he possessed, it was something he was. Within elite society, excess was normalized and celebrated. Christmas, weddings, and political alliances became stages for demonstrating wealth and influence. Gifts were chosen not for sentiment but for impact, designed to impress peers and reinforce dominance. Exotic objects, rare animals, and enslaved people were exchanged as symbols of favor and prestige. The Baron learned to receive these offerings with practiced composure, evaluating their value not in human terms but in what they said about his standing among other men like him. His sense of superiority insulated him from empathy. Suffering occurred beyond his immediate emotional reach, absorbed into the background noise of a state life. If an overseer reported punishment or discipline, the Baron heard efficiency and correction, not pain. Distance allowed him to remain untroubled, and privilege ensured that consequences never touched him directly. Over time, this emotional detachment became a defining feature of his character, a shield against doubt or remorse. Family loyalty, too, was shaped by hierarchy rather than affection. Blood mattered insofar as it preserved the title, the lineage, and the estate. Relationships were transactional, marriages strategic, children investments in the future. The Baron grew accustomed to viewing even his relatives through the lens of advantage and obligation. Love, when it appeared, was conditional and controlled, never allowed to interfere with power or reputation. This upbringing created a man who moved through the world with unshakable confidence, rarely pausing to reflect on the systems that supported him. He believed himself enlightened, civilized, and benevolent by the standards of his class. Any criticism from outside that class was dismissed as ignorance or rebellion. He had been trained, deliberately and thoroughly, to see domination as destiny and resistance as disorder. Yet beneath this cultivated certainty lay fragile foundations. His authority depended on silence, compliance, and distance from the consequences of his actions. The Baron could rule comfortably only as long as the humanity of those beneath him remained abstract. His power required faces to blur into categories, voices into statistics, and histories into footnotes. The moment individuality threatened this abstraction, the entire structure risked collapse. The Baron's belief in absolute authority was not born from malice but from conditioning so complete that alternatives seemed unimaginable. He was the product of a system designed to reproduce itself through tradition, fear, and reward. Every reinforcement of his dominance pushed him further from accountability, further from recognizing the shared humanity he denied others. His confidence rested on the assumption that the world would always bend as it had been taught to bend, that no moment would ever force him to confront the personal cost of his inherited power, that no gift placed before him would ever reflect his own blood back at him. Standing silently, waiting to be acknowledged as more than property, as more than a transaction, as more than the inevitable outcome of a life built on unquestioned authority and the belief that some lives were meant to be owned and some were meant to command, a belief that had never truly been tested until the day it stood before him in chains among the ruling class. Christmas was less a sacred observance than a carefully staged display of hierarchy, a ritual where generosity was measured not by compassion but by spectacle. The exchange of gifts functioned as a language of power, each offering carrying an unspoken message about wealth, allegiance, and dominance. For nobles like the Baron, the season provided an opportunity to reaffirm social order, to remind peers and dependents alike of who possessed the means to give and who existed to receive. Within this distorted celebration, human lives were folded seamlessly into tradition, transformed into commodities wrapped in ceremony. Enslaved people were presented as luxury items, their value determined by youth, strength, beauty, or perceived obedience. To gift a person was to demonstrate extraordinary influence, signaling access to markets and networks beyond the reach of ordinary landowners. Such gifts were not considered morally troubling within elite circles. They were discussed openly, even casually, alongside silverware and horse. The language used stripped away humanity, replacing names with prices and origins with descriptors meant to increase desirability. In this way, the act of gifting an enslaved person became normalized, insulated from scrutiny by custom and mutual reinforcement among those who benefited from it. The Christmas season intensified this practice. The religious narrative of giving was reinterpreted to suit the interests of the powerful. Charity sermons were twisted into validations of ownership, suggesting that a kind master was a righteous one. Enslaved people, when framed as gifts, were portrayed as blessings bestowed upon the recipient, proof of favor and success. The violence that made such exchanges possible was carefully hidden behind festive music, lavish meals, and ritual politeness. Guests rarely questioned the origins of these gifts, preferring the comfort of tradition over the discomfort of truth. For the Baron, such exchanges were familiar. He had both given and received enslaved people before, each time participating in the choreography expected of his station. Gratitude was expressed with measured restraint, appreciation calculated to acknowledge the giver without diminishing one's own status. These moments reinforced bonds among elites, creating a shared complicity that strengthened their collective authority. To reject such a gift would have been seen as an insult, a disruption of social harmony, even an act of moral arrogance. The presentation itself followed a grim etiquette. The enslaved person would be brought forward, often cleaned and dressed to enhance their appeal, though never to the point of dignity. Silence was expected from them, obedience assumed. Any display of emotion risked punishment later. Onlookers evaluated posture, scars, and demeanor with detached interest, as if assessing livestock. Compliments might be offered about temperament or potential usefulness, never about individuality or inner life. These exchanges also served as warning. By displaying ownership so publicly, masters reminded everyone present of the consequences of defiance. The enslaved person, standing at the center of the room, embodied the reach of elite power. Their presence reinforced fear as effectively as chains or whips, embedding control into the fabric of celebration. Christmas, a time meant to symbolize peace, instead became an annual rehearsal of domination. Women, especially, were treated as particularly valuable gifts. Their bodies were politicized, sexualized, and traded under the guise of domestic utility. To gift a woman was to offer not just labor but access, control, and unspoken permission. Such transactions were wrapped in euphemisms, described as household assistance or companionship, masking exploitation behind respectable language. The recipient was expected to understand the implications without them ever being stated aloud. The enslaved woman presented to the baron that Christmas arrived within this brutal framework. She was not seen as a person with memories or relationships, but as an object carefully selected to please. The giver likely believed the gift exceptional, perhaps even generous, chosen to elevate his standing in the baron's eyes. No one involved paused to consider the cruelty of delivering a human being as festive tribute, because the system depended on that blind. What made this practice particularly insidious was its intergenerational nature. Children of the elite grew up witnessing these exchanges, absorbing them as ordinary. Christmas mornings included not just toys and sweets, but the quiet reshuffling of human property. By adulthood, the ritual felt inseparable from tradition itself. To question it would have meant questioning one's upbringing, one's family, one's faith, and the entire structure that sustained privilege. The church often stood nearby, its bells ringing as gifts were exchanged. Priests dined with masters, blessed tables heavy with excess, and spoke of humility without challenging the ownership of human beings. This proximity lent spiritual legitimacy to the practice, making resistance appear not just rebellious but sinful. Enslaved people were told to be grateful, to accept their fate as divinely appointed, while their sale and gifting were framed as acts of providence. The emotional violence of being gifted was profound. To be handed over without consent, without explanation, reduced a person to pure transaction. Families were torn apart at the whim of seasonal generosity, mothers separated from children because a noble wished to impress another. The calendar itself became a threat, holidays marking not comfort but danger. Christmas for many enslaved people was associated not with joy but with loss. Yet within elite society the practice continued largely unchallenged. Comfort depended on denial, and denial thrived in ritual. By embedding slavery into celebration, the ruling class ensured its continuation. Each year reinforced the last, creating a cycle where tradition justified cruelty and cruelty sustained tradition. The barons shaped by this world had never considered the full weight of such a gift, never imagined that the ritual could turn inward, that the abstraction might fracture, that the human being placed before him could carry a history entwined with his own, that the system which allowed a sister to be wrapped as a present could no longer be kept safely at a distance once recognition began to surface. Once the room's polite silence cracked under the unbearable realization that Christmas had delivered not a symbol of power but a living testament to everything the tradition had erased. The estate gates opened slowly that morning, iron hinges groaning under the weight of winter frost. As a small procession entered the courtyard, wrapped in the muted colors of formality, horses stamped against the cold, their breath rising in pale clouds, while servants paused in their work to observe the arrival with trained indifference. A carriage bearing another noble's crest rolled to a stop, its presence signaling obligation rather than surprise. Christmas visitors were expected, and gifts more so. What stood out was not the arrival itself, but what followed when the carriage door was opened. An enslaved woman was led down the steps, her wrists bound not tightly enough to wound, but firmly enough to remind her of her place. She was dressed neatly, deliberately so, her clothing chosen to suggest care while concealing coercion. Her posture was rigid, practiced through repetition, eyes lowered in the manner demanded of her long before this day. Snow clung to the hem of her dress, as she stood still waiting for instruction, her breath shallow, each exhale visible in the cold air. The guards flanking her avoided her gaze, not out of kindness but habit. Inside the manor, preparations paused as word spread quietly among the household staff. Another gift had arrived. Some servants turned away quickly, unwilling to look too closely, while others watched with a mixture of curiosity and resignation. No one spoke aloud what everyone understood. She was not a guest, not a visitor, not a person to be welcomed. She was property, delivered with ceremony and expectation. The silence surrounding her was deliberate, a way of smoothing the moment so it could pass without discomfort. The baron was informed with a subtle knock and a murmured announcement, phrased carefully to maintain decorum. He rose from his chair without urgency, adjusting his coat, his expression neutral. He had received many such offerings before, each blending into the next, each reinforcing his position within the network of men who traded power through possession. As he walked toward the receiving hall, his thoughts were occupied not with the human being waiting outside, but with the social implications of the gift and what response would be expected of him. When the doors opened and she was brought inside,
The warmth of the hall contrasted sharply with the cold she had endured moments before. Candlelight flickered across polished floors and gilded walls, illuminating the space where she now stood exposed. The scent of pine and spiced wine filled the air, mingling uncomfortably with the tension carried in with her. She did not look up immediately, aware that even an accidental glance could be interpreted as defiance. Her stillness was not calm but survived. The giver stepped forward, offering formal words of greeting, his tone light, almost cheerful, as though discussing a horse or a painting. He spoke of her strength, her obedience, her usefulness, each trait listed like features in a catalog. The Baron listened politely, nodding at appropriate moments, his attention divided. He assessed her as he had been taught to do, noting her age, her health, her silence. At first nothing seemed unusual, nothing worthy of pause. It was only when she was instructed to step closer that the rhythm of the room shifted. As she moved forward, candlelight caught her face more fully, revealing details that had been lost in shadow. A faint scar near her brow, the shape of her cheekbones, the set of her mouth when she pressed her lips together to steady herself. The Baron's gaze lingered longer than intended, an unease forming before he could name it. Something about her features disrupted the familiar distance he relied upon. She felt the weight of his stare, and struggled to maintain her composure. Years of conditioning had taught her how to disappear within herself, how to shrink without moving, how to make her presence as unobtrusive as possible. Yet in that moment standing before him she sensed a change, a tension that did not belong to her alone. The room felt smaller, the air heavier, as though something unspoken pressed against the walls. The Baron dismissed the attendants with a gesture, more abruptly than courtesy required. The giver hesitated, surprised, but complied, offering final pleasantries before retreating. Servants withdrew as well, leaving the two of them standing across from one another in a space meant for celebration. The crackle of the fire filled the silence, each sound amplified. The Baron stepped closer, his movements slower now, more deliberate. For the first time she lifted her eyes, drawn by instinct rather than permission. Their gazes met briefly, and in that instant, the practiced roles faltered. Recognition did not arrive fully formed, but fragments surfaced, disjointed and unsettling. A memory of laughter echoing down a corridor long ago, of a shared meal, of a voice calling her name before that name had been taken from her. She felt a tightening in her chest, a pain sharpened by hope she had learned to suppress. The Baron recoiled slightly, as though struck, his breath caught, and he looked away, then back again, searching her face with growing intensity. The resemblance he could no longer deny clawed at him, dismantling the careful categories he depended on. She was not supposed to be familiar, she was not supposed to matter. Yet the closer he looked, the more the past intruded, breaking through layers of denial built over years. She stood frozen, fear and confusion battling within her. To speak was forbidden, to acknowledge recognition could be dangerous. Yet the truth pressed against her like a scream held too long. Her life had been shaped by loss she never fully understood, by stories whispered and silenced, by a family severed without explanation. Now, standing in this opulent room, she felt the unbearable weight of proximity to something she had thought forever unreachable. The Baron's authority wavered, not in outward display but in the subtle betrayals of his body. His hand trembled slightly before he clenched it into a fist. His thoughts raced, scrambling to restore order, to reassert the distance that had protected him. The room, decorated for Christmas, seemed suddenly accusatory, its symbols of faith and generosity mocking the reality unfolding within it. Outside, bells rang faintly in the distance, marking the hour. Life continued beyond the walls of the manor, oblivious to the fracture forming at its center. Inside, time felt suspended, caught between the roles they were expected to play, and the bond neither could erase. The arrival that had been meant to affirm power instead exposed its most devastating consequence, collapsing years of abstraction into a single unbearable confrontation that neither tradition nor authority could fully contain.
The moment of recognition did not arrive as a single revelation but as a slow unraveling, each second pulling loose a thread the Baron had spent his life carefully knotting. At first he told himself it was coincidence, a trick of candlelight and memory, the mind's tendency to invent familiarity where none existed. He had seen thousands of faces shaped by hardship, faces marked by hunger, fear and obedience. Similarities were inevitable, yet even as he clung to this rationalization, his eyes betrayed him, returning again and again to the same details he could not dismiss. Her gaze, when it met his, carried a depth that unsettled him. It was not pleading in the way he expected from those who stood before him in chains, nor was it vacant with resignation. There was something measured in it, restrained yet searching, as though she too were weighing a truth too dangerous to voice. He felt an unfamiliar tightness in his chest, An unease that did not stem from threat or defiance but from intimacy, from the sense that a boundary had been crossed without his consent. Fragments of memory surfaced against his will, a younger version of himself running through sunlit corridors, the sound of footsteps following close behind, a voice calling his name with laughter in it, not obligation, a small hand tugging at his sleeve, demanding attention. These images had no place in the hall where he now stood, surrounded by symbols of authority and dominance, yet they intruded with quiet persistence, blurring the edges of the present. He straightened his posture instinctively, as though authority alone could dispel the confusion. His training urged him to reassert control, to restore the familiar distance between master and property. He reminded himself of the categories that had always governed his world, the clear divisions that made order possible. She belonged to one side of that divide, he to the other. Blood, memory and resemblance were irrelevant within a system that thrived on separation. Still the words rang hollow even in his own mind. She noticed the change in him before she understood its cause. His earlier indifference had given way to scrutiny, his eyes no longer gliding past her but fixing on her as if searching for something lost. Fear tightened her throat. Recognition could be as dangerous as invisibility. She had learned long ago that familiarity invited punishment, that any hint of shared humanity threatened the fragile rules that governed her survival. Yet something in his expression mirrored her own turmoil, and that reflection stirred emotions she had buried for years. Her thoughts raced through memories she had been forced to fragment to endure, a childhood abruptly ended, a home that dissolved without explanation, names erased and replaced. She remembered being told to forget, to adapt, to accept the story handed to her because resistance only brought pain. But standing there under his gaze, the past surged forward with brutal clarity. She saw not the baron, not the master of the estate, but the boy who had once shared her blood, even if he no longer shared her fate. The silence between them stretched, thick and oppressive. Each crackle of the fire sounded too loud, each breath too deliberate. The baron's mind grasped for escape routes, for ways to reframe the moment before it fully formed. If he acknowledged what he saw, everything he believed about himself would fracture. His authority depended on distance, on the ability to look at another human being and see only function. Recognition threatened to collapse that distance, turning abstraction into accusation. He took a step back, then another, as though physical space might restore emotional separation. His heart pounded, not with fear of exposure but with the terror of understanding. If she was who he suspected, then his world was built, not merely on cruelty but on betrayal of blood. The system that had granted him comfort had devoured his own family, and he had benefited from its silence. This realization pressed against him with unbearable weight. She watched him retreat, and felt a strange mixture of dread and longing. Confirmation shimmered just beneath the surface, unspoken yet undeniable. Part of her wanted to speak, to name the truth and force it into the open, to reclaim something stolen from her long before chains were placed on her wrists. Another part understood the danger of such honest words could destroy what little safety she possessed, and she had survived too long to surrender to impulse. The baron turned away briefly, his reflection catching in a mirror along the wall. For an instant he did not recognize the man staring back. The confidence he had worn like armor seemed thin, brittle, unable to shield him from the consequences of memory. He thought of the stories told within his family, of whispered explanations for disappearances, of uncomfortable gaps never questioned. He had accepted those omissions as necessary, as irrelevant. Now they returned with sharpened edges. He faced her again, and his voice when he spoke sounded foreign to his own ears. He asked her name, a question he had rarely bothered to ask of those he owned. The act itself felt subversive, an acknowledgement that she existed beyond her assigned role. She hesitated, weighing the risk, then answered softly. The name struck him like a blow, echoing one he had not spoken aloud in decades. A name erased from family records but preserved in memory despite his efforts to forget. The confirmation shattered what remained of his certainty. His mind reeled, struggling to reconcile the woman before him with the sister he had lost, or abandoned, or allowed to be erased. He wanted to deny it, to dismiss the resemblance and the name as coincidence, but the convergence was too precise, too cruel. The room seemed to close in around him, its festive decorations now grotesque in their irony. She saw the truth settle into him, and felt a sharp ache bloom in her chest. Recognition did not bring relief, it brought grief layered with anger, a reckoning she had never expected to face. He stood there clothed in power and privilege, while she bore the marks of survival, and yet the bond between them refused to disappear. It hovered in the space between them, fragile and dangerous, demanding acknowledgement. Neither moved, Neither spoke further. The moment stretched on, suspended between revelation and denial. Outside, the world continued its rituals, unaware of the collision taking place within those walls. Inside, two lives shaped by the same origin stood divided by choices, systems and silence, bound together by a truth that could not be unseen once recognized, a truth that threatened to unravel not just their relationship, but the very foundation upon which the Baron's identity had been constructed. Before the world fractured into titles and chains, there had been a time when their lives ran alongside each other without hierarchy, when the idea of ownership had not yet poisoned the meaning of family. Their childhood unfolded within the same walls, though even then the boundaries were quietly being drawn. He was raised openly as the heir, surrounded by tutors and expectation, while she existed in a more ambiguous space, acknowledged but never fully claimed, cherished in private yet hidden in public. As children they did not understand these distinctions, only that they shared moments that felt ordinary and safe. They played in the gardens where tall hedges created secret corridors known only to them. She followed him through pathways he insisted on leading, even when he did not truly know the way. He boasted of adventures he would one day have, repeating stories he had overheard from adults, and she listened with wide-eyed attention, believing every word. When he scraped his knee she was the first to notice, the first to offer comfort, tearing a strip from her dress without hesitation. In those moments she was not lesser, and he was not superior. They were simply children bound by proximity and affection. Meals were another place where their difference hovered quietly at the edges. He ate at long tables beneath watchful eyes, taught manners and restraint, while she was fed in smaller rooms, supervised but less scrutinized. Yet sometimes when the household was distracted, they shared food stolen from the kitchen, laughing softly as though conspiring against the world. These small rebellions felt thrilling, a shared secret that belonged only to them. Neither recognized that such stolen moments were already rehearsals for loss. Their mother, careful and fearful, watched them with mixed emotion. She loved them both, but love was constrained by survival. She knew the danger of acknowledgement, the cost of defiance in a household governed by inheritance and appearance. Affection was rationed, delivered in fragments that could pass as coincidence. A hand lingering too long on a shoulder, a whispered word meant for only one ear. The children sensed this caution without understanding its cause, absorbing the tension like air. As they grew older, lessons began to separate them more visibly. He was taught to command, to expect obedience, to see himself reflected in the estate's power. She was taught to be useful, to be quiet, to anticipate needs before they were spoken. Their paths still crossed, but less often, and always under watch. The freedom of early childhood narrowed into supervised interactions, then into rare encounters marked by awkwardness neither could name. There was a day when everything changed without announcement. She was told to pack her few belongings, though no one explained why. He was sent away to lessons earlier than usual, unaware that absence was intentional. The household moved with practiced efficiency, avoiding his questions, redirecting his attention. By the time he returned, her room was empty, her presence erased as though it had never existed. When he asked where she had gone, he was told a story that sounded complete enough to accept and vague enough to discourage further inquiry. She meanwhile was ushered into a different world entirely, one where her name was spoken differently or not at all. The transition was abrupt, violent in its suddenness. One day she belonged somewhere however precariously, and the next she belonged nowhere. Familiar faces vanished, replaced by commands barked without context. She searched crowds for him instinctively, expecting him to appear and explain the confusion, to restore order as he always had in their games. He never came. Years passed, reshaping memory through necessity. He learned not to ask questions that unsettled adult. The absence became normalized, folded into the background of his life. New responsibilities filled the space where curiosity might have grown. He told himself that whatever had happened was unavoidable, decided by forces beyond him. Guilt flickered occasionally, unformed and easily dismissed. He was rewarded for compliance, praised for focus, encouraged to look forward rather than back. She learned a different lesson. Memory became both refuge and burden. She clung to images of her early years as proof that she had once been more than what she was becoming. At the same time, remembering hurt, it highlighted the injustice of her present, the arbitrariness of her suffering. To survive she learned to compartmentalize, to lock away parts of herself that threatened to overwhelm. Childhood became something she visited only in fragments, never fully, never safely. Their shared past existed in parallel silences. He remembered her as a vague presence, softened by time, stripped of urgency. She remembered him as a lifeline that had failed to hold. Neither knew the full truth of the other's fate,
Lies and omissions had done their work efficiently, creating two separate narratives from one origin. What bound them despite everything was not just blood, but the imprint of those early years. Habits formed in childhood lingered unconscious. The way she tilted her head when listening, the way he pressed his lips together when thinking. These gestures survived distance and trauma, resurfacing years later to betray what words had concealed. Recognition was possible only because something had endured, preserved beneath layers of conditioning and pain. The cruelty of their separation lay not only in its violence but in its subtlety. It had been executed quietly, without confrontation, allowing those responsible to avoid accountability. Childhood was dismantled not through a single act, but through a series of calculated decisions, each justified as necessary, each compounding the damage. By the time they stood on opposite sides of the world, the path back had long since vanished. Yet the memory of what they had been to each other remained powerful enough to resurface when faced with truth. Shared laughter, shared fear, shared beginnings refused to disappear entirely. Those early years, brief and fragile, carried more weight than all the titles and chains that followed. They formed the emotional fault line beneath everything that came after, waiting silently until circumstance forced it into view, until the past they had been denied confronted the present they were expected to accept. The truth of how they were separated did not belong to a single moment, but to a series of deliberate choices, made behind closed doors, each one cushioned by rationalization and fear. The family understood the danger long before the children did. Bloodlines were currency, and purity was guarded not out of morality but inheritance. The presence of a child who complicated lineage threatened more than reputation. It threatened the seamless transfer of power. Silence became the chosen instrument, sharp enough to cut ties without leaving visible wounds. Whispers circulated among elders first, careful and contained. Advisors spoke in euphemisms, never naming the problem directly, framing it instead as a matter of prudence, of future stability. The child was discussed as an inconvenience, a vulnerability that needed managing. Love existed, but it was deemed impractical, something that had to be subordinated to continuity. Decisions were made incrementally, allowing each participant to feel less responsible, each step small enough to justify. The mother's role was the most painful and the most constrained. She was bound by dependence, by the understanding that resistance could cost her everything, including the child she sought to protect. She argued softly, in private, bargaining for time, for gentler outcomes, for assurances she knew were fragile. Her affection was weaponized against her, used to extract compliance. She was promised that distance would be temporary, that the child would be placed somewhere safe, that memory would soften the blow. These assurances were never intended to be honored. The father's involvement was colder, shaped by calculation rather than fear. He viewed the situation through the lens of legacy, measuring outcomes against risk. Acknowledgement was unacceptable. Adoption into another branch was discussed and dismissed. Erasure proved simpler. The child would be removed quietly, her absence explained with stories vague enough to discourage inquiry. He convinced himself that this was mercy, that a clean severance would spare future pain, ignoring the violence embedded in disappearance. Records were altered with practiced efficiency. Names were struck through or replaced, dates adjusted, documents that might invite questions were sealed or destroyed. What could not be eliminated was reframed. Servants were instructed in what to say and what not to say, their livelihoods tethered to obedience. The household learned the new narrative quickly, repeating it until it felt real. In this way complicity spread outward, a network of silence reinforced by fear. The Baron, still young, was shielded from the mechanics of the decision. Adults spoke around him, redirecting his attention, offering distractions. His questions were met with partial truths delivered gently, then firmly. Curiosity was treated as a phase to be corrected. He learned the cost of persistence through subtle reprimand, praise withdrawn, warmth replaced with formality. Conditioning did the rest, teaching him which topics led to discomfort and which earned approval. For the girl, concealment took a different form. Her identity was stripped in stages, each one justified as adaptation. Names changed first, then routines, then expectations. She was told stories about her past that did not include choice or explanation, only inevitability. The language used around her emphasized gratitude and survival, reframing loss as opportunity. Resistance was met with consequences calibrated to enforce compliance without leaving marks. The family's decision was not unique. It mirrored a broader pattern within their world. Children who threatened order were absorbed into systems designed to erase origins. This familiarity made the act feel less monstrous to those who authorized it. They could point to precedent, to tradition, to the quiet approval of peers who had done the same. Moral weight was diffused across custom, making accountability feel abstract. As years passed, the initial guilt dulled, replaced by the comfort of routine. The absence became normalized, woven into the family's story as though it had always been that way. Occasional reminders surfaced in unguarded moments, but they were quickly suppressed. To acknowledge the truth would require confronting not just one decision but a cascade of choices that followed, each compounding the harm. Denial proved easier than reckoning. The Baron inherited this silence along with his title. By the time authority rested in his hands, the concealment had hardened into tradition. He benefited directly from the erasure, his claim uncontested, his narrative unblemished. Any lingering discomfort was reframed as childish confusion long since outgrown. He told himself that whatever had happened had been necessary, that adults had acted wisely, that outcomes justified methods. Meanwhile, the woman carried the consequences of those choices daily. The lack of answers became a wound that never closed. She sensed that truth had been withheld, that her displacement was not random, but without evidence she could not challenge the story imposed upon her. This uncertainty shaped her understanding of herself, fostering a vigilance born of instability. She learned to read silences, to detect what was not being said, to survive within gaps. The cruelty of the family's role lay in its precision. They did not act in rage or panic but with intention and planning. Each step was designed to minimize disruption for themselves while maximizing control. Compassion was rationed, allowed only insofar as it did not interfere with outcome. In choosing concealment, they prioritized appearance over humanity, continuity over connection. When recognition finally occurred years later, it threatened to expose not just a personal tragedy but an entire architecture of lies. The family's careful construction depended on time and distance to remain intact. Memory was the one variable they could not fully contain. Despite efforts to rewrite the past, traces endured, carried in gestures, in names that echoed too closely, in faces that refused to align with the stories told. The weight of this concealment pressed on the present, collapsing years of denial into a single moment of clarity. What had been buried to preserve power resurfaced with force, revealing how thoroughly the family had sacrificed one child to protect another, how willingly they had allowed love to be subordinate to legacy, how silence had been cultivated not as absence but as an active, sustaining presence that shaped every outcome that followed, binding blood to betrayal in a way that could no longer be disentangled once the truth began to surface.
The conflict that seized the Baron after recognition was not loud or dramatic but internal, corrosive, eating steadily at the structures that had defined him. Power had always provided clarity. It told him who he was, where he stood, and how others should relate to him. Blood, on the other hand, introduced ambiguity, emotion, obligation. The two forces forged within him, creating a tension he had never been taught to resolve. He could command armies of servants, dictate outcomes, shape lives with a signature, yet he could not command his own conscience once it awakened. His first instinct was resistance. Authority had conditioned him to believe that feeling was weakness, that hesitation invited disorder. He told himself that blood was irrelevant in the face of law and ownership, that systems existed precisely to override personal attachment. If he allowed sentiment to interfere, what would remain of him? His title, his reputation, his control all depended on his ability to remain detached. Acknowledging her as his sister threatened not only scandal but self-destruction. He feared that one concession would unravel everything, yet blood refused to stay silent. It surfaced in ways he could not suppress. Her presence disrupted his routines, haunted his thoughts, intruded into moments where certainty once lived. When he issued orders, her face appeared in his mind, reframing his authority as theft rather than right. When he prayed, the words felt hollow, their comfort replaced by accusation. The system that had always protected him now felt brittle, incapable of absorbing the truth without cracking. He watched her from a distance, searching for ways to restore separation. He scrutinized her behavior, seeking flaws that would allow him to categorize her again, to reduce her to something manageable. But each observation only deepened the conflict. Her restraint reminded him of discipline once praised in himself. Her endurance echoed the resilience his family admired in heirs. Traits he had been taught to value appeared in her without the privilege that shielded him from consequence. For her, the conflict took a different shape. Power was something that had been imposed upon her, not granted. She had learned to navigate it cautiously, to survive under its weight without challenging it directly. Blood complicated that survival. The knowledge that her oppressor shared her origin introduced emotions she had no framework to process. Anger, grief, longing and fear tangled together, each threatening her carefully maintained composure. She did not seek recognition for comfort. She knew better than to expect reconciliation or justice. What unsettled her was the involuntary pull of familiarity, the instinct to search his face for traces of the boy she once knew. That instinct felt like betrayal of herself, of the pain she had endured. She despised the part of her that still wanted acknowledgement, that still measured him against a memory untouched by chains. The Baron oscillated between assertion and retreat. At times he doubled down on authority, issuing harsher commands, reinforcing distance through formality. At others he withdrew, avoiding spaces where she might appear, delegating responsibilities he once controlled directly. His behavior confused those around him, though none dared question it openly. Power allowed inconsistency without explanation, but internally the strain mounted. He considered solutions that preserved his dominance. Selling her away crossed his mind, a clean severance disguised as pragmatism. The thought repulsed him more than he expected. Execution, an unthinkable cruelty, surfaced briefly as an abstract possibility before he recoiled from it. Emancipation, too, presented itself, but not as freedom. It felt like exposure, a public ignition that threatened everything he had inherited. Every option carried a cost he was unwilling or unable to pay. She sensed his instability and adjusted her behavior accordingly. Survival had trained her to read power shifts with precision. She became quieter, more invisible, minimizing any action that might provoke decision. Yet invisibility now carried its own risk. She could no longer be unseen in the same way. Knowledge had altered the terrain. Even silence spoke. The psychological conflict deepened into moral fracture. The Baron could no longer pretend that cruelty was abstract. Every act of ownership became personal. Every exercise of power a reminder of what it required. He found himself hesitating before decisions he once made without thought. This hesitation infuriated him. He resented her for causing it, even as he resented himself for needing her absence to feel whole again. Blood demanded responsibility. Power demanded suppression. These demands were incompatible. To honor one meant violating the other. The system he lived within offered no guidance for reconciliation. It had been designed to function precisely by preventing such conflicts from surfacing. When they did, the solution was erasure, not integration. She grappled with a parallel fracture. Blood suggested connection, a shared origin that implied mutual obligation. Power denied that implication, reducing her to an object within his domain. Holding both truths simultaneously exhausted her. She questioned whether recognition had been a mistake, whether ignorance might have been kind. Yet the truth, once known, could not be returned. Their interactions became charged with unspoken meaning. Every glance carried weight, every command echoed with history. Neither could act naturally because natural roles had collapsed. Master and slave were roles enforced by violence. Brother and sister were roles denied by convenience. What remained was a void where identity should have been. The Baron's authority depended on coherence, on a stable narrative about who he was and why he ruled. Blood destabilized that narrative by introducing contradiction. If his sister could be enslaved, then his power was not ordained but contingent, sustained by cruelty rather than destiny. This realization threatened to strip his authority of its moral veneer, exposing it as mere force. She understood, perhaps more clearly than he did, that the conflict could not end without loss. She had lived with loss all her life. He had been protected from it. Now it encroached upon him, demanding payment long deferred. The irony was not lost on her. Power had insulated him until blood forced vulnerability upon him without permission. Neither spoke openly of the conflict, because language would force resolution. Silence allowed postponement, a fragile equilibrium maintained through avoid. Yet silence also sharpened the tension, turning every moment into anticipation of collapse. The psychological battle did not seek victory but survival. He struggled to preserve an identity built on dominance. She struggled to preserve dignity within a structure designed to erase it. Blood pulled them toward recognition. Power pushed them toward denial. Between these forces, neither could stand unchanged, and the space they occupied grew increasingly unstable as the system that had once held everything apart now failed to contain the consequences of its own design. Her endurance was not the loud kind that announced itself through defiance or spectacle, but a quiet discipline forged through years of observation and restraint. She had learned early that survival depended on controlling what others could see. Pain was hidden, anger swallowed, hope rash. In a world where every gesture could invite punishment, dignity became an internal posture rather than an external display. It was something she carried within herself, invisible yet unyielding. Silence was her first language of resistance. She spoke only when spoken to, and even then with measured calm. Words were tools that could be turned against her, twisted into evidence of insolence or ingratitude. By limiting them, she retained a degree of control over her inner life. Silence allowed her to observe, to remember,
to endure without surrendering her sense of self. Those who owned her mistook this restraint for emptiness, never realizing it was intentional. Her body bore the marks of her circumstances, but she refused to let those marks define her. Each morning she composed herself with care, smoothing her clothing, steadying her breath, presenting a version of herself that could not be easily broken. These small rituals were acts of preservation. They reminded her that she was still capable of choice, however limited, still capable of shaping how she moved through the world. She listened more than she spoke, absorbing the rhythms of power around her. She learned which footsteps signaled danger, which voices carried threat disguised as kindness. This attentiveness was not submission, but strategy. Knowledge offered protection, anticipation reduced harm. Through careful observation, she navigated spaces designed to deny her autonomy, finding narrow paths where dignity could survive. Her endurance was also rooted in memory. She carried within her the knowledge that she had once been someone else, that her existence had not always been defined by ownership. This memory was both burden and anchor. It reminded her of what had been taken, but it also affirmed that what she was now was not all she had ever been. Even when the world insisted otherwise, she knew she was more than a function, more than a possession. In interactions with others she maintained a composure that unsettled some, and comforted others. Overseers expected fear, masters expected gratitude, but she offered neither. Her calm was not compliance. It was refusal to perform degradation. By denying them the emotional responses they sought, she preserved a private autonomy that could not be confiscated. Dignity manifested in how she treated those around her. Even within constraints, she found ways to extend kindness, sharing what little she could, offering quiet reassurance to others who suffered. These gestures were small, often unnoticed, but they reinforced her sense of humanity. In acknowledging the humanity of others, she affirmed her own. When confronted with cruelty, she did not always resist outwardly. Resistance, she understood, was not always possible without catastrophic cost. Instead, she practiced endurance as a form of long resistance, a refusal to be reshaped entirely by violence. She learned when to bend and when to hold firm, when to yield and when to protect what remained inviolate. The recognition of blood intensified this endurance rather than breaking it. She did not plead, accuse or collapse under the weight of revelation. She carried the truth with the same composure she had cultivated over years. This restraint was not indifference, but control. She refused to grant him the satisfaction of seeing her unravel, refused to allow recognition to strip her of the dignity she had fought to maintain. Her silence in those moments spoke volumes. It communicated boundaries he could not cross without consequence. It reminded him that recognition did not grant absolution, that blood did not erase years of suffering. By withholding emotional display, she maintained authority over her own narrative, denying him the comfort of easy reconciliation or forgiveness. She endured the gaze of others with the same steadiness, aware that attention could be as dangerous as neglect. She kept her movements deliberate, her expression composed, her presence measured. In doing so, she controlled how much of herself the world could access. Dignity, for her, meant deciding what could be taken, and what could not. Her inner life remained rich despite deprivation. She recalled songs, fragments of stories, images of landscapes she had known. These internal resources sustained her when external conditions sought to reduce her to labor and obedience. By cultivating an inner world, she ensured that ownership could never be complete. Endurance did not mean acceptance. It meant survival without surrender. Each day she persisted was an act of defiance against a system that sought to erase her. Her dignity was not granted by anyone. It was claimed, reinforced daily through choices that others dismissed as insignificant, but that, to her, constituted freedom. In the presence of power she did not diminish herself. She understood the difference between submission and humility. She offered the former when necessary, never the latter. Her sense of self remained intact, protected by layers of restraint, memory and intention. This inner strength unsettled those who expected brokenness, who mistook compliance for consent. Her endurance reshaped the space around her in subtle ways. It forced those who observed her to confront their assumptions, to recognize that control did not equate to conquest. Dignity persisted despite every effort to extinguish it, manifesting not in grand gestures but in sustained presence. She did not know what future awaited her, whether recognition would bring change or further harm. She prepared for neither hope nor despair, choosing instead to remain grounded in the present. Survival had taught her that anticipation could be dangerous. What she trusted was her ability to maintain dignity regardless of outcome, to remain herself even when the world insisted she was something else, carrying her silence like armor, her composure like a boundary, her humanity intact beneath every imposed name and every unchosen role, standing firm in a posture of quiet resistance that required no audience and no validation beyond the certainty that she had not been reduced to what had been done to her. The moral hypocrisy surrounding Christmas on the Baron's estate was a constant, unspoken presence, a shadow that lay across every gilded decoration, every polished floor, every carefully arranged meal. The season was intended, outwardly, to celebrate mercy, charity and goodwill. Candles were lit, hymns were sung, bells rang in the quiet of winter, and feasts were prepared with meticulous care. Yet beneath the surface, these rituals masked a world built on violence, exploitation and denial, a world in which the trappings of celebration served to conceal the cruelty that enabled it. The juxtaposition between spectacle and reality created a tension that few dared to acknowledge, and fewer still had the capacity to comprehend its depth. The Baron moved through the hallways with practiced ease, aware of the elaborate performance expected of him. He greeted visitors with a courteous bow, offered small talk that demonstrated refinement, and oversaw the presentation of gifts with the detached attention of someone managing a collection of objects rather than human life. On the surface, the estate reflected order and tradition. Underneath it reflected mastery of a moral contradiction so pervasive that it had become invisible. He participated in the celebration without pause, yet the arrival of the enslaved woman as a gift threatened to expose the lie that sustained the ceremony. Her presence made the veneer of morality brittle, revealing that generosity had been appropriated as a tool of dominance rather than a practice of empathy. For generations, Christmas had been appropriated by the elite as a way to reinforce hierarchy. The gifts exchanged were chosen for their symbolic weight, not for the comfort or happiness of the recipient. Rare fabrics, precious objects, and in the most extreme examples, human beings were presented as tokens of allegiance, proof of power and confirmation of status. To participate without objection was to validate the system. Questioning it, even internally, was considered dangerous because it implied recognition of moral obligation beyond self-interest. The Baron had been trained to accept and perpetuate this framework without pause, and for years he had done so unquestioningly, never having to confront the human cost hidden behind ritual. The arrival of his own sister as a gift shattered this equilibrium. It transformed abstraction into reality. Until that moment, moral hypocrisy had been a theory, a convenient lens through which he interpreted the world. Now it had form, presence, and recognition. The woman standing before him embodied both the injustice of the system and the intimate truth he had never allowed himself to face, that cruelty could touch even those closest to him, that the framework he relied on to define order was fundamentally flawed, and that his own blood had been subjected to the very transaction he had always rationalized as normal. The holidays, meant to symbolize peace and joy, had become a mirror reflecting the depth of his complicity. Observers within the estate responded in ways that reinforced the systemic denial. Servants, conditioned by years of enforcement and expectation, treated the presentation with the same polished attention they afforded every seasonal ritual. Their compliance was not born of agreement, but of survival. They did not challenge the morality of gifting human lives. They could. Silence was safety, politeness was survival. Yet even as they executed their roles flawlessly, they could not fully mask the subtle tensions that radiated from the room. Every movement was measured, every glance controlled, every gesture performed with awareness that the space had become morally charged in ways no ritual had accounted for before. The moral contradiction was also enforced by religious pretense. Hymns and prayers filled the estate, offering a veneer of spiritual purpose. Clergy attended the feasts, blessed the meals and spoke of humility, charity and goodwill. Yet they rarely confronted the underlying reality of human suffering that the gifts represent. Spiritual authority lent legitimacy to what was otherwise indefensible. By blessing the exchange they normalized it, enabling participants to reconcile faith with exploitation, ritual with oppression. Yet when faced with the immediacy of kinship and recognition, even this authority faltered. The religious symbolism that had long sustained moral delusion no longer offered refuge. Conscience and tradition collided in a way the Baron had never experienced. For the enslaved woman the holiday brought no warmth, no joy, no sense of safety. Christmas for her had been redefined not as a moment of celebration, but as a reminder of her vulnerability. She had learned to navigate the season carefully, to anticipate gestures of control, masquerading as generosity, to understand that benevolence often carried conditions, and that display often concealed violence. Her recognition by the Baron complicated this survival strategy. The moral hypocrisy of the holiday now intersected with personal history, and her endurance, her silence, and her dignity became acts of subtle resistance against the layered cruelties of a world designed to deny her agency. The Baron himself wrestled with the psychological implications of the moment. Every tradition he had observed, every ritual he had performed, now seemed contaminated by its reliance on a system that had violated his own family. The ethical framework he had depended on to maintain order and self-assurance no longer held. Acts that once appeared virtuous now revealed themselves as exercises in domination, and the seasonal display of generosity felt hollow and performative. This internal collapse was as profound as any external threat, because it challenged not only his actions but his identity, forcing him to confront the disparity between principle and practice. Yet he remained constrained by the expectations of society. Public acknowledgement of wrongdoing or moral inconsistency carried consequences, not just for him but for the estate and his legacy. The social codes of the elite demanded appearance over substance, performance over introspection. Moral hypocrisy thrived in this environment because deviation threatened not only individual authority but the stability of an entire social order. Even as recognition gnawed at him, he understood that any overt reaction could destabilize the carefully maintained equilibrium, and that reality itself was policed as strictly as custom dictated. This interplay between appearance and reality amplified the moral tension inherent in the holiday. The candles, the music, the polished halls, and the carefully arranged gifts were instruments of obfuscation. They created a sense of normalcy in an inherently abnormal act, offering participants a way to participate in cruelty while feeling righteous. Every decorative flourish, every ritualized action, reinforced the idea that tradition legitimized behavior that, in isolation, would have been intolerable. But the arrival of his sister challenged that logic, exposing a fissure in the structure that had long sustained denial. The psychological and emotional weight of this hypocrisy was compounded by the physical environment. The estate, designed to impress, isolate, and control, now amplified tension. Wide corridors, gilded chandeliers and polished floors that had once conveyed security and dominance became a theater for confrontation and moral reckoning. Every reflective surface, every echoing step served as a reminder of the duality of their existence, outwardly ordered, internally fractured. The contrast between spectacle and substance, between what was celebrated and what was suffered, became impossible to ignore. In this space, the meaning of Christmas was transformed. Where tradition had celebrated generosity, it now exposed injustice. Where ritual had masked cruelty, it now illuminated it. Where faith had justified hierarchy, it now demanded accountability though unspoken. The holiday that had once insulated the Baron and those around him from moral discomfort, now pressed against him, insisting that he confront what he had avoided for years. This collision of performance and reality, of ritual and conscience, demonstrated the depth to which moral hypocrisy could shape lives and institutions, and how fragile the veneer of propriety could be when confronted with truth that could not be ignored. When the rituals of celebration became inseparable from the revelation of betrayal, when the season of giving transformed into a season of reckoning.
The culmination of recognition between the Baron and the enslaved woman unfolded not in a single dramatic confrontation but through the slow, suffocating weight of accumulated realizations. Each movement, glance and silence contributed to an atmosphere dense with moral, emotional and psychological tension. The house, once merely a stage for display and authority, became a crucible where the structures of power, family and identity were tested. The walls that had contained hierarchy and ritual now reflected back the contradictions inherent in a system built on both domination and denial, and within those reflections they were forced to confront truths that no amount of tradition could hide. The Baron's mind struggled to reconcile authority with intimacy, control with vulnerability, ownership with blood. His training, his upbringing and the societal frameworks in which he had been raised demanded detachment, a rationalization of power that could justify cruelty and normalize exploitation. Yet recognition dismantled this carefully constructed psychological architecture. He found himself unable to categorize her as he had been trained to categorize the enslaved, unable to see her merely as property. The familiar tools of calculation, social hierarchy, and expectation no longer sufficed to navigate the complexity of the moment. Each of his instincts to command, to distance, to suppress feeling, came into conflict with the visceral reality of family. She in turn faced a tension equally profound. Her survival had depended on observation, silence, and endurance. She had cultivated a world within herself that remained untouched by the demands of ownership, a private sovereignty in a life where her autonomy was constantly constrained. Recognitions threatened to disturb that internal balance. The revelation that the man standing before her was both master and brother forced her to reconcile past memories with present realities, to navigate the treacherous intersection of personal history and systemic oppression. Her composure, though outwardly unshaken, concealed the immense emotional labor required to maintain a semblance of control amid upheaval. The season itself amplified the stakes. Christmas, intended to symbolize charity, generosity, and human connection, now stood in stark contrast to the lived reality of cruelty and objectification. Festive decorations, candlelight, and music became ironic accompaniments to the moral confrontation unfolding in the hall. Symbols of joy and communion highlighted the absence of justice and the weight of betrayal. Ritual, once protective, now exposed the dissonance between societal ideals and the brutal truths hidden beneath. The juxtaposition rendered every interaction charged with significance, every gesture imbued with unspoken meaning. The Baron attempted to navigate the space with authority, but each assertion of control faltered. Instructions, gestures, and attempts to maintain ritualized decorum felt hollow. His usual confidence was undermined by the presence of intimate truth that could not be ignored. Authority, which had once insulated him from reflection, now collided with accountability. Every command he issued carried the weight of past failures, complicity, and unacknowledged guilt. He realized that dominance over her could not restore the distance needed to preserve self-image or social performance. Recognition had rendered his usual tools inadequate. She maintained her endurance, but it was not passive. Silence, measured restraint, and composure became strategies to assert agency within a situation designed to deny it. Her response demonstrated that power, though socially sanctioned, could not fully erase individuality or memory. In holding herself intact, she confronted him with the humanity that had been systematically stripped from those around them. Her continued presence, both literal and symbolic, destabilized the environment, forcing him to reckon with the consequences of a system that allowed her suffering and positioned him as its beneficiary. Memory played a crucial role in shaping their interaction. Shared childhood experiences, fragmented yet potent, emerged in subtle gestures and expressions, disrupting the hierarchy the Baron relied upon. Familiarity in posture, cadence, and movement became evidence that neither distance nor time could fully erase. These reminders of shared origin introduced dissonance, challenging the Baron's perception of authority and self, while simultaneously complicating her perception of survival and obedience. Recognition, once surfaced, could not be unlearned or ignored, and it imposed a moral and emotional burden that neither ritual nor social expectation could mitigate. The tension extended beyond the immediate individuals to the social environment of the estate. Servants, visitors, and family members unconsciously absorbed the conflict, sensing the fracture even if they could not name it. Their reactions, or lack thereof, reinforced the performative nature of authority and the limitations of societal norms in mediating moral truth. Social structures provided cover for cruelty, but in this intimate context they could not conceal the rupture. Every observer, even passive, became part of a tableau in which the moral consequences of the system were undeniable. This confrontation underscored the profound instability of systems built on dehumanization. Authority relied on the suppression of empathy, the categorization of individuals as objects or property, and the normalization of inequality. Recognition, however, reintroduced individuality, history, and emotional connection into a space that had previously denied them. The moral and psychological impact was immediate and destabilizing. The Baron's assumptions about control, ownership, and identity were no longer reliable. The woman's resilience and dignity made the constructs sustaining his authority appear contingent and vulnerable. The emotional labor required on both sides was immense. The Baron struggled to contain guilt, fear, and the cognitive dissonance of recognizing a loved one within a system he had rationalized for convenience and self-interest. She managed the intersecting pressures of survival, endurance, and the internalization of past trauma, while simultaneously processing the recognition of shared origin and the potential implications of such knowledge. Their shared history became both a source of pain and a reminder of what had been lost to cruelty, tradition, and societal expectation. At the same time, the situation demonstrated the limitations of silence as protection. While restraint had served both of them in navigating previous hardships, recognition imposed a new reality. Avoidance was no longer sufficient. Truth had resurfaced, demanding attention and reflection. The Baron could not simply reassert authority without confronting the ethical, personal, and social dimensions of what recognition implied. Similarly, she could not retreat into invisibility without sacrificing the dignity and acknowledgement she had cultivated within herself over years of endurance. The moral, psychological, and emotional stakes were magnified by the seasonal context. Christmas had long served as a veneer for complicity, a time when display substituted for reflection and spectacle substituted for justice. Yet in the intimate confrontation of recognition, these symbols, songs, decorations, rituals,
highlighted the profound ethical dissonance of the estate and the society it reflected. The juxtaposition of ritual and reality exposed the limitations of power divorced from conscience and the enduring consequences of past decisions on present lives. Their interaction became a complex negotiation of space, presence and identity. Every gesture, every pause, every look carried multiple layers of meaning. Silence communicated boundaries, composure asserted agency, and recognition destabilized authority. The moral framework that had previously governed the Baron's behavior could no longer contain the psychological weight of truth. Likewise, the systems that had shaped her endurance could not fully mitigate the implications of recognition. Each moment became a test of self-possession, of the capacity to navigate truth without collapse, and of the endurance of dignity against structures designed to suppress it. In this crucible, both were forced to confront the consequences of inherited social structures, familial secrecy and personal complicity. Recognition rendered moral hypocrisy visible, exposed the fragility of authority built on exploitation, and demonstrated the persistence of individuality despite systemic oppression. The space between them was no longer defined by possession or social expectation but by shared history, ethical complexity, and the unspoken demands of conscience. Each moment demanded negotiation, reflection, and resilience, revealing the depth of endurance required to survive in a world structured to erase identity, manipulate memory, and normalize injustice, while simultaneously confronting the emotional and moral truths that had been suppressed until recognition could no longer be avoided. The culmination of all these moments, the recognition, the endurance, the moral and psychological upheaval, left the Baron and the woman suspended in a space where past and present collided. The lavish halls of the estate, meant to celebrate wealth, power, and tradition, now seemed hollow, echoing with the weight of truth that could not be silenced. The Baron, forced to confront the reality of his own complicity and the vulnerability of blood ties, could no longer rely on authority alone to shield him from conscience. The woman, through years of survival, dignity, and quiet resistance, had claimed an inner freedom that even chains could not take away. In that charged silence, the power of recognition became clear. It was neither vengeance nor reconciliation but a reckoning. It demanded awareness, introspection, and the acknowledgement that actions once dismissed as acceptable carried consequences that reached far beyond intention. Their shared blood, once hidden or ignored, now bound them in a truth too powerful to avoid, reshaping every interaction and every perception. Authority without justice, tradition without conscience, and ownership without humanity could no longer stand unchallenged in that room. The story of that Christmas, often remembered for its outward pageantry, becomes instead a testament to the persistence of identity and the inevitability of truth. No matter how systems of power attempt to erase, divide, or distort human connection and memory, endure, asserting themselves when least expected. The woman's presence, her resilience, and the Baron's forced confrontation of reality illuminate the consequences of moral compromise and the enduring cost of silence. Ultimately, the strongest lesson emerges not from punishment or redemption but from acknowledgement, a recognition of what was taken, the recognition of what survives, and the recognition that dignity, blood, and conscience cannot be entirely subordinated to custom, wealth, or authority. That fateful encounter transformed the holiday from a ritual of performance into a moment of revelation, leaving an indelible mark on both their lives and on the very understanding of power, morality, and human connection. It is a reminder that no facade, no matter how grand or carefully maintained, can indefinitely conceal the truths that dwell within families, within history, and within the human heart. Recognition once faced demands reckoning, and endurance, once proven, cannot be undone. The Baron and his sister stood then not simply as master and slave but as witnesses to a truth that transcends titles, walls, and chains, a truth that will echo far longer than any gilded Christmas decoration or ceremonial gift ever could.